How many genders are there? Literally see the pores on your face, bro. All right.
Here are 9 words that you should immediately delete from your manuscript. These are the words that just clutter up your book and just make it look a little bit more amateurish. I'm gonna give you the category of each word and then the word itself, and I'll also give you plenty of examples and give you a reason why you should cut this word. Number 1, weasel words. So Matt Bell is an author who often gives fiction advice in his newsletter, No Failure, Only Practice. And a while ago, he wrote one on why you should delete what he calls weasel words. Now, the weasel word that troubles him the most, that he finds always in his stories, that he always deletes, is the word that. He said that when he was editing his novel Scrapper, he ended up deleting 800 examples of the word that. I mean, think about how long 800 that's is. That's pretty much 3 full pages. And in a 300-page novel, that means just the word that would have constituted about 1% of his entire book. That's crazy. Because it's not like the word that is getting you anything with the reader. Like, no reader's gonna finish your book and be like, I really liked the that's. So take a look at this example of when you can cut a that. She told me that she would wrestle the alligator. So if you delete the that, the sentence still makes perfect sense. She told me she would wrestle the alligator. So in most of the situations where you have a that, you can delete it and it's not gonna hurt the meaning of the sentence at all. Can you delete all of them? No, absolutely not. Like, don't misunderstand me on that. You do need some that's. Like, it actually does fulfill a grammatical role, but not all the time. So what are some other weasel words? Maybe you don't personally struggle with that, but maybe, you know, you have another weasel word that's a problem. I would recommend searching your manuscript for the word just. Just is one of those sneaky words that sort of worms its way into a lot of sentences, but you can often delete it and the sentence really won't lose anything. And if you found that advice on weasel words to be helpful, please check out Matt Bell's craft book, Refuse to be Done. It's all about revising your book. It is excellent. I highly recommend you read it, and I will put a link in the description. The second category of words you should delete from your book is puff words. So David Foster Wallace is the one who came up with this term of puff words, and I find it really surprising that he was the one to say, hey, don't use puff words, because this is a guy who has like the most extensive vocabulary of anyone I've ever read. I mean, you're just reading along in his work and all of a sudden he pops out some word like nidificus, which of course I have to look up. I mean, you probably had to look it up too. It means leaving the nest shortly after hatching. So with a guy with a vocabulary like that, it really surprises me the word that he says he absolutely hates and refuses to use. It's the word utilize. In his book Flesh and Knot, specifically the essay 24 Word Notes, he says that you should always use rather than utilize. And you know what? I think he's right. Just compare these two examples. She used the wrench to tighten the bolt. Okay, simple, clear, I get it. Compare that to, she utilized the wrench to tighten the bolt. Do you tighten up or like grimace a little bit at that second one? It's just ugly. He would describe utilize in that second example as a noxious puff word. The goal of that word is really to convince the reader that the author is someone smart, but I think how it comes off is that the author just seems like a pretentious twit. There are lots of other examples of puff words out there, so let me run through a couple of those too. Commence instead of begin or start. Expedite instead of speed up. Endeavor instead of just try. I mean, try is pretty simple. Or this one is a corporate one, which is particularly horrible. Synergize. I mean, you could just say like collaborate or something like that. So when you're picking words for your manuscript, don't try to be gratuitously fancy. Delete those super fancy words and replace them with clearer, simpler, plainer language. The third category of words you should delete is filtering words. The person who really popularized filter words as a category in creative writing was a guy called John Gardner. And I've talked about him before on this channel in my outrageously difficult writing exercises video. So Gardner has a few books for writers. Probably his most famous one is The Art of Fiction. You should read it, it's fantastic. And in that book, he talks about the problem of writers using these filter words. And basically a filter word is just this veil between the reader and the thing that's being described. And here are some examples of filter words. He watched, she noticed, he saw. You probably have hundreds of unnecessary filter words in your book, and you have never before seen them as something that you could probably delete. So compare these two examples. He watched the black cat jump over the fence versus what if you took those two filter words out? The black cat jumped over the fence. probably 70% of the time, you can completely delete the he watched or she watched. I completely made up that statistic, but also I am willing to go to the mat for it. So, you know, fight me if you want. That's because most of the time, there's no
92%
reason
of
to
all
draw
statistics are made up.
attention to the fact that your character is the one seeing or watching or noticing. If we're already in the character's consciousness, then when they say a black cat hopped a fence, we already know that they are the one that saw that because there's not another person to witness it. Once again, I'm not saying to delete it every single time. Like, there are perfectly good reasons why you should use filtering words, but you probably use too many. The advantage of using fewer filter words is that it makes the reader feel like they're closer to the action, like they're experiencing it with the character rather than the story being mediated by a character who's telling them what's going on. And also, if you cut filtering words, it's shorter. And, you know, shorter's better. The fourth category of words you should delete from your manuscript are time words. So Elmore Leonard, the master crime novelist who's behind stuff like Get Shorty and The Switch, his vendetta is against the word suddenly. So I made a video about his 10 rules of writing. You should watch that if you haven't watched it. But his 6th rule is don't use the word suddenly. Imagine how much you have to hate a word to make 10 rules for writing. You're limited to saying 10 things, and in one of them you say, don't use this word. That's a serious vendetta right there. But why he says this is absolutely crucial. Basically, he says that if you set up the scene properly, then you don't need the word suddenly. You don't have to announce, oh hey, like something big is about to happen, because the reader is already on the edge of their seat anticipating that thing. So let's look at an example of this, right? You could write, suddenly, a shot rang out. Now, what's funny about this example is that writing suddenly, the goal is to make the shot more surprising, right? Like, oh no, a gunshot. But what suddenly does is it actually dampens the effect of that gunshot rather than heightening it. The gunshot is happening less suddenly because you stuck in this massive, long, 3-syllable word before the actual gunshot happens. Just say a shot rang out and the reader's gonna be like, oh, whoa. Oh, okay. Now, maybe your problem isn't the word suddenly, maybe you don't use that often, but you probably use at least one of these other time words. For example, the word then. I think far too often writers write and then, as if we need something to indicate like, oh, this is what's gonna happen in the future. And then this. Well, we already know what's happening, right? Just say and explain the thing that's happening. Or words like next, after that, subsequently, or finally. Ultimately, the reader knows that your book is happening chronologically. And most of the time, they don't need a time marker to guide them along that path. The 5th category of word that you should delete from your book is empty calorie words. Some words really don't add anything to your story. They are all syllables and no substance. These are empty calorie words, which they basically pad your word count for your book, but they're not really helping the storyline along. So for an example of an empty calorie word, I'm gonna pick a word that I personally hate. All the other sections in this video about famous authors hating one word or another. This one's from me. The word that you should delete is something. So let me ask you, what do you know after the word something? Nothing. Not even something. You literally know nothing after using the word something. It is drearily vague. There is zero specificity. So basically, every time that I write something, I triple check it. Can I just cut it entirely? Some of the time. Can I substitute it for a more specific word? Often this is the right move. Or the third option is, can I avoid it entirely by simply changing the structure of the sentence? Also a good idea. So right now, open your manuscript and do a search for the word something. You know, maybe you've only used it a couple times. In that case, you know, it might be necessary in every single one of those examples. But if you find that you're using it quite frequently, that's often a good sign that it's a filler word and you got to delete that and put something in its place. So let's take a look at this example. There was something creepy about the old house. Now, part of the reason that this sentence gets into trouble is that it's a very passive construction. I had this old writing professor in college that used to say the weakest way to start any sentence was the phrase, there was, because it's an empty phrase, sort of like something. Right? There was what? You've already wasted 2 words and you've said absolutely nothing. Anyway, so how would we rewrite this? Well, you could just demonstrate the creepiness instead of telling the creepiness. The old house groaned in the winter storm. See, the winter storm and the groaning gives us the sense of creepiness without using the word creepiness. Or if you want to keep creepy in, then just figure out a different construction that doesn't use the word something. The old house creaked creepily. Okay, that's actually not a great sentence, but you see what I mean, right? You can use creepily in a way that doesn't use the word something. The word something is often an indication that you're not being specific enough. Take a look at this other example. He needed something to eat. Okay, what if you just said, he needed a snack? I think it's clearer. I think it's shorter. I think it's more evocative for the reader. And most of the time it's better. But let me say my caveat once again, like, don't delete every single something from your manuscript. Some of them provide a useful purpose, but if you can edit it out, it's often a good idea. And now here are some other examples of empty calorie words. Stuff, like she grabbed some stuff. Somewhat, like the room was somewhat dark. Anything and everything. As a general principle, I would say that the more specific of words that you use, the more pleasurable it is for the reader. That's why so many people love like these oddball words like petrichor, which means the smell of ground after fresh rain. That is such a highly specific word, right? You don't get to use that every single day. But in general, any word that's highly specific, from armoire to shuffled, does a lot more work for your book than these generalized words that are just empty calorie words. The sixth category of words that you should delete from your book are inflation words. Jessie Rita Hoffman is an editor who wrote for Jane Friedman's blog about why inflation words are bad and why you should delete them. What are inflation words? They're basically intensifier words that sort of hike up the stakes and tension for a passage. A perfect example, like an absolute perfect use case, would be the word really. And here's an example of really in sentences where if you cut it, it probably makes the sentence better. I was really tired after the really long hike. If you just said,
after the long hike.
I was tired after the long hike,
True.
It's a better sentence. But maybe you say to yourself, well, that revision doesn't give me the emphasis that I need. Like, I really want to emphasize that I was super tired. Okay, in that case, I would actually recommend revising the sentence to a different shape. After I dragged myself home, I was too tired to make dinner and fell asleep on the couch. So once again, instead of telling the reader, oh, I'm really tired, you are showing the reader the tiredness. Too tired to cook dinner, fell asleep immediately. Essentially, this is just a word that you should really stop using so much, and it's really easy to misuse. Honestly, your prose would really sparkle if you took it out, but I understand that it's really difficult to cut it. Did you hear how many reallys I just used? I think it's really easy to use that word too often, but if you use it with that sort of frequency, it loses its punching power. Now, here are some other examples of inflation words that you should cut from your book. Very, which is a one that's like on the level of really for being misused. Truly, highly, precisely, totally, and actually. If you think one of those words might be your inflation words, like your pet inflation word that you use way too often, just do a search. Do a search in your manuscript. See how often you use it, and then see how many you can cut out. 7 hedge words. I love the author John McPhee. He's a nonfiction writer, and he wrote this great book about a section of the Mississippi River called Atchafalaya, which now I use as a curse word when I'm angry, like Atchafalaya. It works for me. Anyway, he also wrote a writing craft book called Draft Number 4. It is a great book, especially if you're a nonfiction writer, but I think it helps fiction writers too. I'll put a link to that below too. So in that book, McPhee has this process where he talks about boxing words. And boxing words just means he draws a box around them so that he can come back to them later to decide whether he needs to delete that word or
that's
whether
what
he
I
needs
do
to
with
substitute
the
a different word or something like that. Something like that. You see, even I fall into the trap of using something too often. So some of the words that he ends up boxing are what I would call hedge words. Now, hedge words are basically the opposite of inflation words, right? Inflation words, you're trying to make everything so important and so necessary. But with hedge words, you're really trying to minimize your prose to make it seem like, oh, like this is kind of what I think. So the patron saint of all hedge words, and a word that you should definitely delete from your manuscript, is the word usually. If you have a lot of usuallys in your book, that is a problem. Now, if you're using the word usually in dialogue, that's actually okay, because some of the words that I'm talking about in this video, you need them in dialogue to make the character sound a certain way, because that's how people actually talk. So we're not talking about dialogue, we're talking about in the prose, omniscient narrator speaking. So let's look at some examples. I usually take my coffee with cream and sugar. So you could just cut out that usually and it makes perfect sense. I drink my coffee with cream and sugar.
That's the first one I've come up in my head just straight off of this.
That if that's the way you drink it, that means you usually drink it that way.
Yeah, so we should only talk about it if you're not using it that way.
A little bit, that works too. I prefer my coffee with cream and sugar. The general principle is here, you don't want to hedge what you're saying. You don't want to be fearful of just coming out and saying things as they are and being direct. Now, even if you don't have a problem with usually, here are some other hedge words that you might be guilty of using too often. A bit, sort of, kind of, that's my personal failure. I use kind of too frequently. In a sense, generally, or probably. I doubt you use all of those, but it is likely you misuse at least one or two of them.
Probably use
search
probably
function
too
is your
much.
friend. And now we come to the 8th category of words that you need to cut from your manuscript: sloppy words. George Orwell wrote this seminal essay, Politics and the English Language. And in it, he complains, I mean, you could say whines. I choose not to say whines, but he's doing a little bit of whining. He complains about how the English language has grown just slovenly and lazy and ugly. I mean, was he wrong? No. Would he be wrong today? No. And what he does in part of this essay is he just identifies a bunch of words that have become so overused that all their meaning has been leached out of them. Like they're not doing the work a word should do. His examples are sentimental and plastic when talking about the art world. And in the political sphere, he says that the words freedom and patriotic have been overused. So let me try to offer an update for the modern world. What is a word that gets overused too much in our current era? I think this word would probably be something like literally. You hear people all the time like, it's literally this
that's my word, literally.
Yes, but you didn't need to use the word literally because what you say is already literally. Like that's how people communicate, is they're saying things that are literally true. Words have definitions. Words have meanings. And as writers, we are stewards of language, and we need to like hold the line and not allow words to be used in just completely random and unnecessary ways. I'm calling you to arms, writers. I'm telling you
gatekeep
to stand
that
firm.
fucking
So
words,
what are
man.
other examples of words that perhaps have been overused or misused? I think the word organic actually is another example of these.
Yep, I could definitely see
It's gone
that.
out of the sphere of just like organic foods, and instead anything that's like sort of crunchy and nature granola, oh, that's organic, or it's just natural to the process. There is a very good use for the word organic. I just think it's been used far too often and probably misused.
The painting
in a
was
lot of
organic.
circumstances. Another example might be a
Authentic.
word like low-key. That's low-key cool, you know? I'm really showing that I don't use low-key very much by the fact that I can't even come up with a good example. But I think if you've heard it before, you probably know what I'm talking about. So my advice is to look over your manuscript and try to find sort of trendy, of-the-moment words that have been used far too often or used in a context where they are unnecessary. And here's my final advice about this category of language, is that you need a banned words list, like a personal banned words list that you do not use under any circumstance. I'm encouraging you to be pickier about language, and I'm encouraging you to keep a grudge against some words. Like if you don't have grudges against some words, that's a problem. And now we come to our last category of words that you should delete from your novel. It is number 9, expendable words. Now we come to Strunk and White. You probably knew I was going to talk about them. Maybe you were waiting this entire video just to hear me mention the word Strunk and White. Strunk and White is the Bible of language usage. It is the scourge of a million college freshmen, and it is the most quoted and summarized and forgotten book in the English department. So Strunk and White give this general advice to omit needless words, like I need to omit doing quotation marks. I'll stop. Okay, that's good advice, right? But let's drill down and get a little more specific and talk about what needless words. Now, the technical term for these is separable phrasal verbs, but you probably didn't want to know that. Now, the glory of these expendable words is if you cut half of this phrase, it means exactly the same thing. Like, you lose nothing. I almost said you literally lose nothing. Oh gosh, you guys are gonna roast me in the comments, I know it. So for a premier example of this, look at the phrase, sat down. She sat down. Well, of course she sat in a downwards motion. You cannot sit in an upwards motion. You could cut the down and just say she sat. And the same thing holds true for stood up, right? He stood up. Well, you don't need the up, do you? Because there's no other way to stand. You could just say he stood. And there's a bunch of these type of phrases where we've used the words together so often that we don't even realize we can separate them and we don't lose any meaning. Look at something like the music faded away versus just writing the music faded, or the family gathered together versus the family gathered, Or she returned back home versus she returned home. Or the papers spread out across the desk versus the paper spread across the desk. The principle is this, and we're going to go back and get George Orwell's help from Politics in the English Language. His third rule was, if it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Why make the reader read more than they have to if the meaning is the same? Essentially, the more precise you are with language, the less work a reader has to do. Now, if you haven't already, make sure to open your work in progress, use that search function, and try to cut away some of the words from your book. Your book's gonna